Today I'll be talking about the final speech in the symposium, the speech of Alcibiades. And next week I'll be talking about William Shakespeare's great comic masterpiece, A Midsummer Night's Dream. I'll give 2 lectures on A Midsummer Night's Dream. Roughly speaking, the first lecture will be a more optimistic interpretation of the play, and the second lecture will be a more pessimistic lecture of the play. As with all of Shakespeare's works, there's an integration of darker with lighter or happier themes, and it seems to me perhaps best to consider the play twice in succession from rather different points of view. Please do make sure that you've read A Midsummer Night's Dream. I will not be summarizing the action of the play, and I'm afraid my lectures might be unusually murky about it if you don't know the play already. So do make a special effort to have read the play before I start lecturing on it next week. So, we reached the end of Plato's Symposium. I've tried to distribute the symposium throughout the semester because it seems to me the kind of work that one wants to linger over or to return to from a number of different perspectives. So rather than simply reading it straight through, which of course has its own virtues, I would prefer us to keep going back to it, to look at it in new context, with new ideas, to juxtapose it with different texts or with different movies. So when we come to the final speech, it's important for us to remind ourselves of the entire movement of the symposium that's brought us to the point of Alcibiades' speech. You'll remember that when Socrates entered the house of Agathon, Agathon and Socrates engaged in a certain amount of banter about who was wiser. Socrates poked some fun at Agathon, who had just won first prize in the tragic competition, by exhibiting his tragedies. Actually, it was a set of 3 tragedies along with a satyr play, a satirical, rather comic play. That's the typical way that the Athenian Tragic Festival works. Each tragedian presented 3 tragedies and 1 satirical play, a satyr play. Agathon had just presented those and won first prize. And Socrates talks about how wise Agathon must be to be confident in displaying his wisdom before tens of thousands of people. Agathon sees that Socrates is raising a question, a doubt, about whether that kind of popular entertainment itself is a vehicle of wisdom, or whether the desire to be entertaining might in fact defeat the desire to tell the truth. Socrates compares his own insignificant or ordinary wisdom with this extraordinary, shining, manifest wisdom that Agathon himself must possess. Agathon says, Socrates, I'm not going to argue with you about who's wiser right now, but we will have this argument later. And then Dionysus himself will judge between us. The god Dionysus, or Bacchus, the Roman name that Shelley uses in his translation. The god Dionysus, of course, is the god of both theater and of intoxication. So Dionysus is an especially appropriate god to judge the claim to wisdom of a tragedian, but is also an especially appropriate god to make that judgment at a drinking party, at a symposium. We've just seen Agathon and Socrates give their competing accounts of the nature of love. Agathon, in his speech, presents Eros, the god of love, as young, as tender and soft, and as beautiful, and most of all, as a poet. And with a sly look at the man lying on the couch next to him, Agathon says, the god of love has nothing to do with ugly, hard, old people. Agathon, the youngest and most beautiful man at the symposium, is clearly getting in his dig at Socrates, the oldest and by far the ugliest man at that drinking party. When Socrates gave his own speech, he tells us that many people make the mistake of thinking the God of love must himself be beautiful. But that's wrong. Eros, love, is in fact neither a god nor a human, but something in between. Something that interprets the divine to the human and the human to the divine. And this intermediate being, call it a daimon, something daimoniacal. This intermediate being is the offspring of a father that's plenitude and of a mother that's poverty. So that the daimon, love, this interpreting, this hermeneutic being that draws together the divine and the human, allows them to understand each other. This daimon Eros is neither plenitude, fullness, nor simple emptiness. What is erotic, what is the nature of erotic love, is always looking for fulfillment, but never quite achieves it. And this restless, searching Eros, Socrates says, must be a tough hunter, not a tender heart in the way that Agathon presented it. Must himself lack beauty because he longs for it so much. So can't be like Agathon. And in the end must be philosophical, must be a lover of wisdom. Not having wisdom like the gods themselves do, but always being in search of it. So Agathon presented the God of love in the image of himself. He presented himself and his poetry and his beauty as the exemplar of what love can be in its full divinity. Socrates provides an alternative. He says that what love is not fully divine, nor either is it merely human. Instead, Socrates says, love is like me. I am the image of love. A restless philosopher always in search of beauty and wisdom, but never fully in command of it. This is the competition in wisdom between Agathon and Socrates. Who then will be the judge of these different views of the way that the erotic enters into human life? Well, at the beginning of the scene, when Alcibiades enters, in Shelley's translation, this is what happens. Now, this is on page 59 of this translation. So we're at 212 around C. After Socrates has finished speaking, the whole assembly praised his discourse, and Aristophanes was on the point of making some remarks on the allusion made by Socrates to him in a part of his discourse, when suddenly they heard a loud knocking at the door of the vestibule and a clamor as of revelers attended by a flute player. In Greek, the nouns all have genders. this flute player is a female. "Go, boys," said Agathon. Boys was the way that Greeks referred to their slaves, no matter how old they were. "Go, boys," said Agathon, "and see who's there. If there are any of our friends, call them in. If not, say that we've already done drinking." This party was over after Socrates' speech. At least it was as over as the wedding feast at Cana would have been if there had been a god there to make more wine. Right? They were done. Their agreement to exclude the feminine and to exclude the Dionysian had been carried out. In speech, it's true, it had been challenged. Socrates, in particular, had brought in speech, a woman as his teacher and spokesperson. But indeed, that exclusion was still operative. The party was over without ever having opened itself up, either to Dionysus or to Aphrodite. But now what happened? A minute afterwards, they heard the voice of Alcibiades. Alcibiades was the most important man in Athens. He was also the most beautiful man of his age in Athens, as Agathon was the most beautiful man of the next generation younger. Alcibiades was famous not only for his association with Socrates, but for being a very bold and many thought reckless political leader, and for being a man who lived a personal life of dissolution and great fun. You may know some people like that. Everywhere Alcibiades went, it was a holiday. So too his entrance into this drinking party. They heard the voice of Alcibiades in the vestibule, excessively drunk. I love that phrase, because of course it implies you could be moderately drunk. Excessively drunk and roaring out, "Where is Agathon? Lead me to Agathon." The flute player, and remember this is a woman, and some of his companions then led him in and placed him against the doorpost. Would have toppled over otherwise. But I guess that's what it means when you're excessively drunk. Crowned with a thick crown of ivy and violets, having a quantity of fillets on his head and his ribbons. The ivy, the violets, and the ribbons are all the marks of the god Dionysus. The god, when he is leading the dance of his revelers, is represented as wearing ivy and violets and ribbons. So Alcibiades enters into this room leading a bunch of ecstatic, intoxicated revelers. It's Alcibiades who will be the Dionysus. And it will be Alcibiades who provides the judgment about the wisdom and love of Socrates. "My friends," he cried out, "hail!" He gives them a very formal greeting. That's part of the humor of the moment. So there's this very drunken, indeed famously dissolute guy who breaks into this party whose whole point was, let's just be sober tonight and have philosophical discussion instead of the usual things you have at a drinking party. And he comes in and bows to everybody and addresses them very formally. "Gentlemen, I greet you. I am excessively drunk already, but I'll drink with you if you will." Notice everything that Alcibiades says as an invitation, he means as a command. He means to possess them in the way a god would possess them. If not, we'll go away after having crowned Agathon, for which purpose I came. I assure you that I could not come yesterday. Remember, Agathon's big victory party was the day before. That's why these guys all had hangovers and were too weak to put up with another evening on Aphrodite and Dionysus. I couldn't come yesterday, but I'm here now with these fillets round my temples, that from my own head I may crown his head, who, with your leave, is the most beautiful and wisest of men. Are you laughing at me because I'm drunk? I know what I say is true, whether you laugh or not. But tell me at once whether I shall come in or no. Will you drink with me? Who could turn him down? Not even somebody with a hangover. So they invite him in. So now the god Dionysus has finally gotten in the door, and he brought with him the flute girl that represented the Aphrodite presence, the feminine presence of music and poetry that had been excluded right after they excluded the drinking, originally, under the direction of Eryximachus, the sober medical doctor. Then Alcibiades takes some of the ribbons off his hair, he crowns Agathon, and he hasn't noticed Socrates is even there on the same couch. So he sits down next to Agathon, right next to Socrates. Socrates is on his other side, but he hasn't looked over to see him yet. It's amazing what a drunk man cannot notice. When he sat down, he embraced Agathon and crowned him, and Agathon desired the slaves to untie Alcibiades' sandals, that he might make a third and recline on the same couch. Party couches could accommodate quite a lot of activity. Alcibiades says, by all means, but what third companion have we here? And at the same time turning round and seeing Socrates, he leaped up and cried out, oh, Heracles, what have we here? You, Socrates, lying in ambush for me wherever I go, meeting me just as you always do, and I least expected to see you. And now what do you come here for? Why have you chosen to recline exactly in this place? Not your Aristophanes or anyone else who is or wishes to be ridiculous, but have contrived to lie down beside the most beautiful person of the whole party. Alcibiades is jealous because he's still in love with Socrates. And he doesn't think it's an accident, any more than we should, that Socrates has ended up reclining on the couch with the most beautiful, the most luscious man available. What happens from here is that Alcibiades is invited to take his place in the round of speeches. But Alcibiades says, oh, that's really not fair to have a drunk man compete with a bunch of sober people like you. So the first thing he says is, you guys got to all catch up with me. He calls for a big pitcher full of wine, and he drinks it down. And then he says, here, fill it up again and give it to Socrates. So that at this drinking party, I realized nobody would do this anymore at a drinking party. Whoever is the most exuberant person sets the standard for how much drinking there's going to be. And other people feel called upon to catch up to the level of intoxication of the most intoxicating presence. It's a very spirited moment. So suddenly, this very sober drinking party has become a different sort of thing. It's been taken over by Alcibiades, the man, who's a sign of the overtaking of philosophy by Dionysus and Aphrodite. Alcibiades is asked to give a speech. He owes us a speech. If you're going to come into the party, you owe us a speech. We already gave our speech. He says, if you want me to give a speech, I'll give you a speech. I'll give you a speech where I tell you the truth about Socrates. Now, we've noted before that every speaker in the symposium up to this point has given a speech about himself. When we talk about love, we mostly talk about ourselves, and these men are no different. Now, they didn't say they were talking about themselves. Phaedrus didn't say, well, look, I've been the object of pederastic interest ever since I was a teenager. And a lot of people think that's not very manly. But I'm going to give a speech that proves that it really is, and that in fact the best soldiers have all been the object of a lot of pederastic interest. He doesn't say that, but that's what he does. Pausanias doesn't say, you know, a lot of people think I'm a little old for the sorts of things that lovers like to do with the rear end of their beloved. But I think there's still a pretty good justification for it, and I'm going to tell you why I'm still Agathon's lover, even though I should have outgrown it years ago. He doesn't say that, but why do you think he says, the reason I'm not in love with anybody is I'm just a good teacher. I hardly even know he has a body. It just gets in the way sometimes. Socrates' speech is obviously autobiographical. He builds autobiography into it. He doesn't say, I, myself, am the interpreter of things divine to human beings. He doesn't say that. But it's clear that his speech means that. In Alcibiades' speech, we get the specifically undiscreet truth-telling of a drunken man. And what makes it specifically indiscreet, is that Alcibiades explicitly tells an autobiographical story, whereas everybody else was pretending to give a general theory, when in fact he was talking about himself. So Alcibiades tells this extraordinary story about how he thought Socrates had fallen in love with him for his youthful beauty. And one night he arranged things to seduce Socrates. But Socrates humiliated him by rejecting not Alcibiades as such, but rather Alcibiades as a sexual partner. Alcibiades so prided himself on his physical beauty that it never occurred to him that Socrates' interest in him would not be consummated sexually. Now, Alcibiades' experience of this humiliation is a complicated one. It doesn't leave him simply angry at Socrates. Instead, it leaves him conflicted. Of course, there's a part of him that's angry about the rejection. But there's another part of him that's drawn to admire Socrates in a way that he admires nobody else. Because now, suddenly, he understands something about Socrates' own virtue that he'd never noticed before. In fact, Alcibiades goes on to say, none of you here, no matter how well you think you know Socrates, none of you here know his secrets in the way that I do. I once saw him open up and saw inside of him such divine images. He goes on and he mentions this 3 times. He mentions both Socrates' words that on the outside seem so plain and everyday, yet on the inside, in their true meaning, has something so divine and challenging about them. And he also mentions Socrates' own virtues. Socrates seems like such an ordinary man until you really appreciate the virtues that he has. Particularly the virtue that he shows when he turns down Alcibiades' sexual advances, when his interest in Alcibiades is something that would be deflected by Alcibiades' physical attractiveness. So Alcibiades says, I've seen the secret, Socrates, that you all overlook. I've seen what's divine inside of him. I see Socrates with the eye of a true lover, the lover who finds in his beloved something divine. In this respect, Alcibiades' speech reminds us of the speech of the lover in the Phaedrus, in the Charioteer. The notion that a lover sees within a beloved a reflection of something sacred, of an image that usually is overlooked or forgotten, but that the experience of erotic attraction can make available to us. So in that respect, Alcibiades is a wonderfully platonic lover. He has seen something beautiful that other people have overlooked or forgotten. But the difficulty for Alcibiades is that this vision of true virtue, this vision that he gets through Socrates, is not strong enough to overcome Alcibiades' attachments to things that are far less than divine. Alcibiades is not able to make his own life Socratic, so that his experience of Socrates' perfection is an experience not of joy, but an experience of shame. As he says to the astonished audience, Socrates can make me feel something that you'd never believe I feel. You'd never believe it because I'm famous for being shameless. I'm famous for being exuberant, for carrying the holiday in my eye wherever I go. But Socrates makes me feel shame. Because when I see into what Socrates is, at the same time, I see what I'm not and what I could be. Alcibiades' shame is the reaction of the visionary lover when he cannot command within himself the resources to imitate what's most perfect in the beloved. This Socrates, then, for Alcibiades, is both extraordinarily lovable and extremely hateful. As he says, many are the times when I wish nothing more than that Socrates would be dead, that he would be no more where I could see him and experience this humiliation. And yet if he died, I would be completely lost, and I would not know what to do. For Alcibiades, too, as we've seen for other speakers, both in the symposium and in other things we've read, there's a very curious connection between love and death. A connection that's mediated by an experience of shame. At the end of Alcibiades' speech, Socrates and Agathon make fun of Alcibiades. Alcibiades isn't surprised. And he tells people, you see, Socrates is doing what he always does. He's acting like a flirt. But the problem for Alcibiades is not that Socrates has been untrue. It's not a problem of fidelity. The problem has been in Alcibiades' ability to follow where he knows Socrates leads. If erotic love has built into its very structure something that draws us to aspire to a more perfect self. A more perfect self we see revealed to us through something our love reveals in our beloved. If that kind of aspiration is an essential part of our erotic life, then the shame or humiliation, the anger, the resentment of Alcibiades will be a threat in any erotic relationship. To open oneself to the beauty of the beloved will also be to open oneself to the ugliness, the incompleteness, the limitations of oneself. And it is on that disturbing note, the way that Socrates inspires both love and hate, that the symposium ends. It's not surprising, perhaps, that the final conversation recorded in the symposium, after everyone else has drunk and gone to bed, or at least passed out on the floor, the final conversation is between Socrates and Agathon, the great writer of tragedy, and Aristophanes, the great writer of comedy. And we're told that Socrates was trying to force Agathon and Aristophanes to admit that anyone who could write a great comedy should also be able to write a great tragedy. And anyone who writes a great tragedy should also be able to write a great comedy. It's Socrates himself who seems to embody that integration of tragedy and comedy, an integration that comes out in both the shame but also the enduring love of Alcibiades. It's this possibility of an integration of tragedy and comedy that I'll take up in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. See you then.